Do you remember when you first met George?
Yeah. It was in the spring of 1931. He and Beshka were living down in the village on Barrow Street and off 7th Avenue. And I don't know how, but Benny Herman and I heard that George was in New York, and we called him and ran up to meet him. And we became quite friendly at that point. And then we saw him quite a bit during the spring. And then George and Beshka went back to Paris. And the following fall, the fall of 1931, I had a Juilliard fellowship. And the Juilliard had a new building on 120th Street and 122nd Street and Claremont Avenue. And George was commissioned to write Helen Retires. And George turned up at the school, and it was 6 months after he had been away, and we started the friendship all over again. And then the following summer, I was in Europe. That was the summer of 32. And I went to Cagnes-sur-Mer and stayed with George and Beshka about a week, and then took an apartment in the town. And so we spent that summer together. I don't know. We've been friends steadily ever since.
Who were the other people at Cagnes-sur-Mer?
At Cagnes-sur-Mer, at that time, I don't know. There were a lot of painters and writers. And I had, what's his name's apartment? Soutine's apartment.
Oh, yeah.
I took Soutine's apartment.
Were you together then?
No. I was 18 years old.
Oh.
I was 19 that summer. And then, I don't know, then they came to New York, and George and Beshka were living on 55th Street, and then George was doing, he was doing a film for Ben Hecht, and he got me to act as his assistant and orchestrator. And we worked in New York, and then we worked up in Suffern, where they were shooting the film, of all places. And that was a wild experience. I don't think... Yes, they did use George's score in the end. But I had left. I had a ballet that was going on in Chicago, and I went out to Chicago before the film was finished. Then I saw George again in Hollywood in 37. We were all out there together again. I don't know, our lives kept crossing.
You moved to Hollywood when?
Well, the first time I went to Hollywood was in the fall of 36, and winter of 36, and 36. And George and Beshka had come out. He was going to do The Plainsman. Beshka was pregnant. And well, by this time we were such close friends that whenever we were in the same town, we called and saw one another. I had also played the Airplane Sonata on the radio. I played it in some concerts. And
tell me about the radio performance of that.
Well, Arthur Berger ran a series for station WEVD, which was going to be the first series of modern music on radio. And he asked me to take over 2 of the programs. And so on one of the programs I played George's Airplane Sonata and part of the Ives' first sonata. And on the other program I did Ives' songs.
What was WEVD?
Well, it was a station set up by the labor unions. And it's I think they've sold it now. But it was W. Eugene V. Debs. And it was the first kind of radio station that played serious music and had lectures and poetry readings, etc., etc.
Did they tend to have political material on it as well?
Oh, well, everything was political at the time. This is now, I'm talking of 1933 or 34. everybody was very busy trying to solve the Depression, and any idea was analyzed and discussed and argued about and fought over. And you had Marxist Leninism, and you had Stalinism, and you had Trotskyism, and you even had Lovestoneism. There were Lovestoneites, and there were, there were about 15 economic theorists running around with in the know. And
sounds like a good climate for musical anarchy also.
No, the music was a little different. The music was quite organized, and there wasn't much modern music played. Benny Herman and I ran a series of concerts in New York. Slanimsky would run some. Henry Cowell did some.
On the radio, you mean?
No, we didn't get on the radio.
Oh, I see.
We didn't get on the radio. The only time we got on the radio was a concert that Benny and I did. We were invited down to Washington to do it at the Library of Congress, and then that was broadcast. But getting modern music on the radio was very difficult. Toward the end of the 30s, when enough modern recordings had appeared, the stations that had begun playing records began to play Debussy and Stravinsky and Prokofiev, etc. You must remember that Debussy was still a modern composer in the 30s. He had only died in 1918. He was 58.
Right.
If he'd lived into the 30s, he would have been a man of 70.
That's right. It wouldn't
You
be that
know?
unusual.
And Le Sacre de Printemps was a new piece. So, and actually, there were a lot of music. Certain conductors played new music. They didn't play George for some reason or other, but Koussevitzky and Stokowski played a lot of new music, and even Toscanini. Toscanini would play people like Malipiero, Ravel, all the new Ravel pieces as they came out, Casella. But Casella even got performed. I remember seeing La Giara at the Metropolitan Opera.
Really?
Yeah. So,
Well, tell me more about how you remember George when you first met him. What was he like as a person then?
oh, he was... Now, mind you, when I first met him, George was 31 years old. From the viewpoint of 17, he was quite old. But he and Beshka were, to me, were the height of sophistication, and they had been around. He'd had international performances, and they were witty, and they were smart, and they were read, and they knew everybody, and I thought they were glamorous.
George at that time wasn't getting so many performances. Was he discouraged, would you say?
Well, he was getting commissions. He got the commission for Helen Retires, and actually, when he came to America, when I met him, it was shortly after Transatlantic had been done in Frankfurt, sure. And he was being played then quite a lot. George's quiescent period happened after the planes. I mean, he stayed out in Hollywood. Maybe he shouldn't have, but he got a job on the newspaper there as a... What was he doing here? Yes, but what was it?
He did some war analysis.
He did some war analysis. He also did like a Lovelorn column for the Daily News, which was a marvelous paper, and it's defunct. Yeah, and he was living down in Manhattan Beach, and we were living in Pacific Palisades, and we would drive back and forth and see one another constantly. And he had stopped writing, and I remember giving him a terrible dressing down for it, and Beshka thanked me for it as they left without George hearing her. And then he called me about 2 days later and said, I'm starting to write my 4th symphony.
Really?
Yeah, you know?
It worked.
And it worked. So obviously it worked.
What was the reaction to composers as they saw Antheil doing these extracurricular activities, as it were? Do you think that had some impact on what they thought of him as a composer?
Well, George came back at a time when Copeland had gotten established, And the whole Copeland Sessions group was established, and Copeland had started the Young Composers Group. I was a member of that. And then there was the new generation that Aaron had gathered together, which consisted of people like Benny Herman, Ellie Sigmeister, Elliot Carter, myself, Arthur Berger. And I even dragged George up to one of those things. Aaron was very funny about George, because Aaron once told me that the one person he'd been jealous of was George Antheil, because George was only about 9 or 10 months older than him. They were both born in 1900. And Aaron in November, I think George was born in January. July? All right, then Kurt Weill was born in January. Right, yeah. The three of them were born in 1900. I remember all three were friends of mine.
And Shrenik also.
Shrenik was born then? Right. Well, I never knew Shrenik. But I did know Weill, Copeland, and Antheil very well. Uh-huh. And Aaron once told me that he was very jealous of George because at the age of 21 or so, he was a student with Boulanger and George was being played all over Europe.
That's right.
You know, it was... But anyway, when George came back, I don't know, he just... He didn't get accepted, and he didn't get performed, and then he began to get more and more inner. And also, George had missed something when he was very young, when he was in his 20s. He had developed a style, and somehow or other, by the time he was 40, that style had disappeared. The Fourth Symphony is very, very much influenced by Shostakovich. Even Transatlantic was influenced by Kurt Weill. He was no longer sure of George Antheil, you know, and he was now looking to write what would be fashionable. And I think that's what destroyed George as a composer.
Did you talk to him about what you thought of his later music, or was that the kind of subject that wouldn't come up between you? No. Every now and then the old flash would come back in a piece, for instance, like Archipelago Antilles. Is that a good piece?
Oh, I love that piece. Uh-huh. You know? And there'd be flashes of the old George, hither, thither, and yon. But most of the time he was wondering, well, what'll sell? You know?
And you know this from talking to him?
Yeah. For instance, I got very excited about, what was that cute little piece, McCluskey Crossing.
Oh, McConkey's Ferry.
McConkey's Ferry.
Yeah, right.
And, which I thought was a very original and very smart piece. And George said, oh, nobody will play that. They're interested in Shostakovich and etc. And I said, well, no. I mean, if you keep doing this, they'll be interested in this. But he couldn't see that, you know. And
what about his operas? Did you happen to attend any of them? Or?
Well, the only opera of George I ever saw was Helen Retires.
I see.
And that really didn't work.
Yeah.
Maybe it would again. It was very well presented, very well sung, stunning sets by Kiesler and Frederick Kiesler. And
I've seen pictures of the costumes. It looks like it might have been awkward to move around in those things.
Oh, no, it was very... Do you mean that second act?
Yeah.
Well, the second act was done very simply, really. They were in black body socks from head to toe, and they would have a piece of a shoulder on them, or a piece of a leg, as if they were broken statues.
Oh, I see.
And and Helen came down in an elevator, standing with her arm on a Greek pedestal, and she looked like a painting of Ingres, you know. And she arrived down this terribly classic French painting, and when she finally found Ulysses, she got him to go with her by finding all the pieces of his that were broken and sticking them on him, and he became a whole statue instead of a broken statue. It was very amusing.
Sounds marvelous. Yeah.
And then originally, for the Champs-Élysées scene, the last act, Kiesler wanted to do it in a French cafe, but they wouldn't let him.
Really?
which I think would have been fun. You know, he had the whole set and they threw it out.
Do you remember much of the music? What style he was writing in at that time? Was it energetic, for instance, or somewhat akin to the 20
Well,
style?
it was energetic, and it was a little bit more like the 20 style than Transatlantic was.
More, say, than neoclassic, which he tried also? Or?
Well, neoclassicism was in the air. There were some neoclassic elements. But I think what defeated the opera, that particular opera, was that the melodic lines didn't happen as melodic lines, do you know? And George had forgotten that opera is a melodic. He once played a bit of Volpone for me, and that seemed much more melodic than the other, but I've never heard Volpone. I would like to hear it.
I've heard a recording of that, and it sounds like something that's worth reviving. It's very exciting, actually.
Well, it sounded more exciting than Helen Retires.
Yeah.
Maybe George was defeated by the libretto because Erskine had written a very talky libretto
It's quite possible.
and not very much action.
You said one time to me on the phone, I think, that you often played George's pieces with him in piano four-hand arrangements.
Well, we would not in piano four hands arrangement. We would sit down if he had an orchestral piece. We would play from his sketches, you know, the 3 or 4 line sketches that most composers work in, and we'd hock it out on the piano because George wanted to hear what the whole thing would sound like.
Did you ever talk to him about the music as you played it, or just read through it, give him advice or feedback on it?
Well, George was very touchy about it. I was very polite if I didn't like the piece, and if I did like the piece, I was very enthusiastic. And that was it, you know. And also somehow or other we got very involved with George's personal life constantly, and George's personal life was a mess. And
Especially later, I suppose.
even early, even in 1932 when I was in, I won't talk about it, when I was in Kenya, it was a mess. Poor Beshka, she really had to put up with a lot.
Yeah. In the last years in New York, George was working at the Music for the 20th Century, the Walter Cronkite CBS television program, and he was living here. You were away?
Well, we had exchanged houses.
Oh, you were in Hollywood.
I had his house,
I see.
and he had this. And actually, I didn't stay in his house long because it was so uncomfortable up there on the hill. It was difficult to get to and get down. There was a hell of a climb up about
That's right,
100
there is.
stairs. And so we moved down below, but he continued to stay here. And then one day, I read in the papers that he had died in the Los Angeles paper. And we called Beshka. She was absolutely to pieces. Then it took Beshka a long time before she could come into this apartment. But then she did. And then she came every time she was in New York. But it took her about 3 or 4 years before she could turn up here. So we only saw her in Los Angeles then.
Carol, what other questions do you think we should talk about George?
You know, you were interested in to see if you could find out more about George, and he has done about George's personality. To see if we pieced together all.
It's
this
hard for us. We
picture.
didn't know George. We just knew Beshki.
And,
you see.
and all these letters that he wrote, all this
Oh,
correspondence.
yes, George was a great
And he
one
would
for
write
writing letters.
35-page
I know.
letters, single spaced to
To
people.
Mrs.
Yeah.
Bach.
To all kinds of
Yeah.
Mrs. Bach, his patron in the
Yeah.
20s. And
But
Incredible.
George was a charmer.
Oh yeah, he was.
He was a charmer. And he had a little boy air that he could put on, you know. And this man in his 50s, still acting a little boy, would get away with it, you know.
Yeah.
He was, George.
Oh yeah, he was.
He was a charmer. And he had a little boy air that he could put on, you know. And this man in his 50s, still acting a little boy, would get away with it, you know.
Yeah.
He was, George was a charmer. He was very short, you know. And
He was about 9 and very
No, he was taller than you. You're 5 foot. He was about 5'3" or 4". You know, he was a very short man. And he and Beshka were almost the same height. Maybe he was an inch or two taller. They would go marching down like two little gnomes. And but he really had charm, and he could beguile a room full of people. You know.
So his personality was not a problem in his getting his music out. Instead, it was an aid.
Oh,
Or did he
actually, it
make
was an
different-
aid. He knew everybody, and everybody came, and he charmed them. But I must say that they all expected the George of the 20s, and he'd present them these pieces that they didn't like. And it was they would be polite about it, but for the most part, they didn't play him. He did get played, though.
It's true. His fourth symphony was done by Stokowski, his
Yeah.
fifth by Ormandy, and the sixth
Yeah.
by Monteur. So,
So,
people
yeah,
did play his
he
music.
did
yeah.
get played. But
in fact, more than many composers.
more than many composers. But he didn't get second performances of those pieces, you know.
Well, that's not true. The fifth was played quite a bit, but not the sixth.
Wasn't it the fourth that was played? Quite a
Both.
bit?
Well, the fifth traveled around for a while as
Yeah.
well, but it's not played anymore.
No. But it's a kind of Shostakovich piece, you
Mhm.
know. It's not very original. It's not as original as those early pieces. They really were
Do
original.
you believe in his contribution in his early pieces as being really vital and original?
To me, they were. You
No,
see, they
no.
influenced me.
Yeah.
They influenced me because, but I was 17, and this was a brand new thing. But I was being influenced by a lot of people then. I was being influenced by Ives. I was being influenced by Copeland. I mean, I was in a ferment, all this coming at me. Well, it was brand new. But then, somehow or other, the pieces got shunted aside, so the whole next generation of composers didn't hear
They
George.
never really heard those
They never
pieces.
really heard him, and he had no effect on them. And I mean, not that I compose like George. I don't. I compose exactly the opposite almost. But there were certain things in it, certain vital things that I realized were possible in music, and that George had them at that time. But he lost it, you know. But whenever it would turn up again in a piece of his, I loved hearing it there. But it became rarer and rarer.
I think in the fourth piano sonata, there's a lot of real fire, and although it sounds like Prokofiev, it also sounds like the early George. There's some of that very metallic kind of sound that he gets out of the piano.
I don't know.
Frederick Marvin recorded that piece.
Freddie did?
Yeah, it's really a beautiful one.
Is he still around?
He's teaching at Syracuse University.
Freddie Marvin?
Mm-hmm. He still plays that piece, too.
Yeah?
I heard him play it recently.
And then another thing was, George was completely uninterested in what was happening in America. He was interested only in what happened in Europe. You know? He'd grown up with Stravinsky and Weill and even the Shostakovich, the early Shostakovich pieces. And Prokofiev. And he was absolutely uninterested in the trends here. And he was living here. Music in Europe was moving in a different direction.
This is by what time now?
The 40s. 40s.
End of the war.
End of the war, during the war, end of the war, into the 50s. He was living here, and the music was moving past him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was still living in the style of Paris in the 20s without the energy, the elegance, and the other thing that his early pieces had.
Yeah, I guess he was a bit, in the early 50s, also influenced by Britain and what Britain had done, Benjamin Britten.
A little bit, yeah. George was constantly looking around to see what was in. He was wrong to do that. I'm sure that's why he allowed that revision of the Ballet Mécanique.
He also revised the Jazz Symphony in 1955, and that version has been the one that's been played quite a bit.
Yeah, but there he did another thing, and that was much more sensible. I had asked him to do that many a time. See, George was not a good orchestrator, and it was very badly orchestrated. And he revised the Jazz Symphony and kind of made it playable.
It was for an awkward ensemble before, you'd say?
No, he'd used the instruments badly.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
You know? And his revision of that thing, I heard it again only about 2 years ago, and it makes a marvelous effect now. Whereas previously it didn't. It was written, instruments were written in the wrong register. Sometimes he had chosen the wrong instruments, you know. And it took very little changing to make it the kind of exciting piece it is now. So that was worthwhile. George, one of the things George, not knowing the orchestra very well, not really being interested in the in orchestration, George paid for it. It's one of the reasons he didn't get played. You know, not that the pieces were difficult, the notes weren't difficult, but they were awkward. You know, and the balances were awkward for conductors.
Mm-hmm. So that caused problems.
That caused problems. You know, and I orchestrated for him. Henry Brandt orchestrated for him. You know, and not on his serious music, but I mean on his commercial music.
What about George's film music? You worked with him on which scores?
Well, I only worked with him on the on the film he did with Ben Hecht, and then I worked with him on a short film that he did during the war. I remember that...
Not Angels Over Broadway.
No. A short film, and it was 2 or 3 reels or something. It was some sort of an experimental film. I remember we were recording it the day the Germans invaded Russia, which must have been 1942, the spring of 42. No. Yes. When did we move?
Was George in Manhattan Beach at the time?
George was in Manhattan Beach. George was in Manhattan Beach. And
so that was 42, I think.
Yeah. Yes, I was working for Warner Brothers then, right after I'd begun working for Warner.
Now, which company did you do most of your film scores for?
Writing? Well, I orchestrated for a while. I got out to Hollywood and I couldn't get a job as a composer, though I already had a Broadway show done by the Guild. I had lots of ballets done, concert pieces done, orchestral works, etc., commissions from Columbia Broadcasting, and then I was considered too modern. Mm-hmm. So I became an orchestrator.
Did George ever help you get a job on
No. I got a job at Warner Brothers, and I orchestrated for. Oh, I became a very successful orchestrator. I hated it, and then I stopped it the minute I could do films, and I began writing films. I did films for practically every studio. I wrote a lot of films. I've written at least 24 films. And then I stopped that because I'd had it.
So what was your next step?
Well, I don't know. While I was writing the films, I was also writing a lot of theater music. You know, while I was writing films and orchestrating, I wrote things like ballet ballads, which got done in New York, and Golden Apple, which got done in New York, and Gentlemen Be Seated that the City Opera did, and I did a ballet for Chicago, The Last Judgment. I did the First Symphony while I was orchestrating. And then I decided I wanted to just compose for myself, the hell with films. And so 10 years ago I wrote my last film and said goodbye to Hollywood.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Just left?
Just left. Well, when George and Beshka opened their galleries, George had an idea of doing a series of concerts. And the idea was to do half the program would be a concert and half would be a film. And we were going to do artistic films. And we did some very amusing concerts and very unusual. For instance, one night we did, I had to stage the musical part for it each time. George really did nothing. He dropped it on Beshka and me. But anyway, I got, we did Kurt Weill and Bert Brecht's Lindbergh Flug before as the first half. And then the second half we did the film of the Three Penny Opera, but we couldn't get the German version, and we got the French version, L'Opéra de Quatre Sous. Pabst had done it in English and French. And you know, I think the French version is better than the English version. And one day we had, we gave a program for Aaron Copland. And Copland played his piano concerto, and Oscar Levant, I got Oscar Levant to play the orchestral part on the second piano. That was a performance, too.
That was all done in the Siegel Antheil Gallery.
At the Siegel Antheil Gallery. And we once did a Poulenc program, and George played some things, and George played the movement perpetuel, and I played the improvisations, and we did the Bal Masqué. And then we did a film with Poulenc music, I think. Oh, no, we did a film with Auric music.
Well, was the gallery a small one?
Well, no, the gallery was pretty good size. It was a pretty good size gallery. I remember Beshka opened with a Miro exhibit. And
Did the work sell?
no, the gallery went broke. But there was no audience in Hollywood for that kind of thing at that, at the time. I mean, anybody who wanted to could have bought some of the best Miros for $200, $300, marvelous oils, and nobody was buying them in Hollywood. They didn't know who Miro was.
Well, they know now.
They know now, yeah.
Good, I was looking at that. I was wondering
Yeah.
for a long time.
Well, in those days, I guess. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say maybe there's something that you didn't ask that he might think to tell you about some memory he has of George or Beshke or some event that stands out in your mind or any good
A lot
stories,
stands out in our
anecdotes.
mind, we can't tell you.
Yes, I can tell you a
Well,
great
you
many
might be
stories.
surprised how much we already know.
Do you?
Well, having
yeah.
know.
We've been collecting stories for a long time. Especially after Beshke died, I think people were
Yeah, more.
Right.
Well,
Yeah,
Beshke, she alluded to a lot of things, but she tried very hard. She really.
She's very proud. I mean,
She's very
very
proud
private.
woman.
Yeah.
She's not one
She
to.
didn't want us to know certain things, but the thing is that we stayed in her house with her all the time. We traveled with her. We saw her all the time for like, how many years
10
since
years.
we met her? For nearly 10 years. And we're very close, just like, she always called us like her other children. And so many things came up, so many times. It was just so obvious things that happened. We never pushed her on it or asked her, but she didn't,
Well,
And
I'll
then
tell you
Peter-
a
Peter
story,
talks
About Peter.
but I
Peter
won't,
talks
I won't,
and
I
stuff,
won't, I won't mention names.
Plus, there's all this
But
correspondence
we met,
between us.
we met a woman in Hollywood, and we became very friendly with her. And one night she had us to dinner, and she suddenly and we were very fond of her. And then she suddenly said to us, she said, you might have difficulties. And we said, why? And she said, I'm George Antheil's mistress.
Which one?
You're not putting this on.
No, God.
No.
Do you think you wanted to?
Well, it was very
This is
embarrassing.
Noma, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, well, she's living right here in New York.
Yes.
Yeah.
Did
Have
you
you
see
seen
her?
her?
Yes. I've seen her.
No, we haven't seen
I haven't
her.
seen her in a
don't
number
see
of
her
years.
anymore.
No.
We don't see her anymore. But anyway, it was a horrible situation for us. We didn't know
It was
what to do.
embarrassing.
'Cause we love
But
Beshke.
we loved Beshke and we loved Noma. So,
She must
well,
have
that
been
was
an
that.
interesting person.
Oh, she is. She was.
Charm you. Should charm you.
Charm you. Well, anyway, she
Doesn't
she
charm
came.
you.
She kept going to Europe, and she kept staying at our apartment. And I thought that Beshke didn't know that we'd known Noma. And one day, Beshke called from Hollywood and said, "Jerry, is Noma there?" Well, we nearly went through the floor.
But I think she enjoyed
So
us
that
talking
was
about it.
she wanted to speak to Noma,
Huh.
and she did.
Well, I discussed it with Beshka on several occasions, and she realized the position we were in and did not hold it against us. She really didn't.
I don't think.
But then a strange thing happened.
We were very
George
good friends.
George decided that he had to be with Noma, and so he moved.
Should we mention it?
He-
We shouldn't have mentioned it.
He had to. Well, he brought up the
Oh,
name.
no, we
So-
already know about this.
So
No, but
he
on
moved
radio,
into
on
the
radio.
It's
This
not
is
on
not
the
for
radio.
nothing.
This is not going
No.
on the radio.
No.
he moved into Noma's house
At Beshka's suggestion.
at Beshka's suggestion.
She's the smart one.
Yeah, actually, that was what she telephoned about to New York. She suggested that they try living together. And I had gone back to Hollywood already. You hadn't. And Noma called me and said, "You must come to dinner. George is now living here." And I went there for dinner. And although he'd been there only 2 or 3 days, you could see he was bored senseless. Well, it lasted about a week, and he
Well,
went back to Beshka.
I truly don't think it was that. If you excuse me, I don't think that it was bored senseless at all. It's just that she did not wait on him hand and foot like
Which Beshka
does.
did.
She wasn't his handmaid.
Well, maybe
and
that's
she-
why he was unhappy. But
Yeah,
he
I
was
mean,
he
you
was
know,
he was surely
See,
unhappy.
Beshki knew no one else would put up with him the way
That's
she
right,
did.
that's
She
right.
knew
think
that.
that's it.
She had put.
But anyway,
she
I
said
was-
She also knew all of George's faults.
The whole situation lasted such a short time that I was the only one who was a house guest during that period.
I don't
you
doubt
know.
it, yeah.
And
Actually, it was Beshke was kind of smart to
Yeah.
call him
She
on
knew
that.
it wouldn't work.
Taught
She
George a
knew how they
lesson,
would put up with
whatever
it.
good it
And
did.
that's it. She knew what George was like.
so that ended it, and George went right back to her, and that was that.
Oh, it's
But at
funny.
one time, it was so
But it was-
serious that she almost divorced him.
Yeah.
Because I remember we rode together on a bus, and she was really down, and she said she knew that it happened several times before, but this looked quite serious.
Yes,
you know.
yeah.
And it was quite serious, because Memo was in love with him too. He was, I guess, with her as much as he could be. But the minute that Norma had to take care, he needed taken care of, you know.
And she was not one for taking care of anybody. She had to be taken care of herself.
Yeah.
Well, no, she was sort of an individual, you know. She
You know,
was-
but
she
anyway,
devoted her
anyway,
life
it didn't
to-
last. But that was
No.
that was the story. We were in the midst of this. It was very embarrassing all around.
Well, you'd known her before anyway, right?
Yes, I had known her outside of Beshka.
Yeah.
But-
Actually, she met George through Beshka. She became a friend of Beshka's, and that's how she met George.
Well, you know, what was the book? Who was the conductor that she was with for a while?
Rajinsky.
Rajinsky.
Rajinsky, and it came out in the book, that his widow wrote. Our Two Lives, I think it was called. And she talks about Noma in there.
About-
mentions
and
that
George
this-
and Norma?
No, well, yes, also that, but the apparently she went off with Radzinsky on a South American tour,
But she wasn't living with Rajinsky.
just for a bit though. She
But
did.
yeah,
take off
she
with- yeah, no,
actually
she never lived with him.
Actually,
no,
it
no.
happened from our house, and Hazel got mixed up in it because she helped Noma get Rajinsky to the
Well,
airport.
you see, the point of it is, yes.
But he needed all the special health
You
care.
know,
Yes.
Which
you
was
know,
also a
Norma
problem.
was going, and George didn't want her to go, you know?
I
And
see.
she was gonna go off, and it was a job, you know, she was hired as a job to
Oh,
go
I
with
see.
Rajinsky to take him.
His wife didn't want to go.
Well,
I
she
Noma
was-
took
She
her.
was gonna fly, and he wasn't gonna fly, or something, I
I
don't know.
see.
No,
Somebody had
he
to
was
be
going to
there.
fly, and she was going to take the boat.
I don't know. Anyway,
And
one
somebody
of them
had
was
to be
gonna do it.
there.
Somebody had to be there. So we went down to his hotel, and I think it was she left from here, and we had left her trunks here. And oh, it was a big mess. But anyway, we went down. I think it was Navarro or Essex House or someplace like that. And to get him down the stairs with all his things, I helped
Down the
him
elevator,
get the
I hope.
elevator and get him
Mm.
down into the cab.
Radzinsky.
Yeah, and we sat him down on the.
He was frail. wasn't
He was
He
sick
was sick.
then.
He was
Yeah.
sick.
He had had some heart
He wasn't
attacks.
frail, but he was sick.
Oh.
And we sat him down like, you know, those things that are around the lamppost till the cab came, you know. We were heading cab. And I don't know. And then I went out to the airport. And while they were at the airport, George had Noma paged at the airport.
Really?
It was all so messy, you know, the whole thing. You know, finally we did get Brzezinski on that plane and off with her and everything, but I don't think it was any.
When she came back, she told one funny story. It was a new concert hall that he was to open in Caracas or Bogota or someplace like that, in Venezuela or Colombia, I forget where. Venezuela, wasn't it? Caracas, I think. Anyway, they had never turned down the air conditioning during the performance, you know.
So you haven't.
And the audience got in there, and it got awfully hot, and they turned on the air conditioning. And all the music went up from the stands, and the middle of the thing went up into the dome. So they had to turn the air conditioning off, and all the music fell down. They had to stop playing, and they had to collect it.
Funny as it can be. Oh, that's funny.
Do you think that George ever really did appreciate Beshka?
Oh yes, after Noma,
I think
George's
he
relationship
always
with
did.
Beshka was
I
different.
think yes, it was different.
It was
and also,
different.
But I think always he really
Because his
knew.
letters.
No,
to
but
her are
after
very
Noma,
lovely.
he was through playing around. He knew that he had to have
but
her.
I think even before Noma that he really loved Beshka.
He really loved Beshka. He always did, but he couldn't
He took her
resist.
But he took her for granted
Yeah,
because
yeah.
She was terribly devoted.
Granted, you know, because she was just there all the time and helping him, and she was everything to him.
Yeah, I think that's.
She was an exceptional woman.
She is terribly devoted to his memory all the time.
Well,
that
I
she-
mean, I've never seen anybody so loyal. She spent all her time trying to, work with Charles to help him with music, and got letters from people about the school.
It was very touching to us to see
She
that,
did
especially knowing that these
always
things had
wanted
gone on
to
and
do
that she
anything
wasn't
she
Oh,
could
she
help
terribly
him.
happy all the
She
time.
loved him dearly.
Yeah.
She really loved him dearly. And she was.
She
an
was, by the
exceptional
way,
person.
an exceptional woman. She
She
was a
was,
great
and
woman.
Extraordinary woman.
brilliant.
Extraordinary woman.
She was really-
I would say that in retrospect, as I think about it, I like Beshka more than I did George. There were lots of things I didn't like about George, but Beshka, I never could find any fault. She
Yeah,
was a marvelous person.
That's right. And
She was Marcus, Beshka Marcus, and her mother was Schnitzler's sister.
did you talk to her about her early days in
Mhm.
Hungary?
Yes.
Did she have much to say about that?
She said it was just an ordinary. She hated the family. It was just a typical
We
middle
met her
class.
sister, in Holland.
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
She was awfully bright woman and a pianist. They didn't get along so well until the last 2 or 3 years.
I didn't know she had a sister. To tell you the
She
truth.
never
Oh.
told. I mean, that's.
I didn't know.
Clara.
I didn't
Clara.
know
She
that.
never talked about her family.
Marvelous woman.
She once talked to me about Schnitzler because I was a great Schnitzler fan.
You read a lot of his work.
I read a lot of Schnitzler.
And then we happened to meet the Schnitzler boy who worked on a film.
Yes, I worked on a film with
Germany.
Schnitzler's grandson.
And then we went to Schnitzler's house in Germany,
His-
in Vienna.
His son and his daughter-in-law.
Yeah,
But
it was very peculiar having known
Yeah.
Beshka,
With-
it was also
and all the Schnitzler
small
mementos
world,
around. But oh yes, I certain pieces of Schnitzler like the Nocturne, and Fräulein Elsa and Casanova's Homecoming, I think are all the short novels. I think are among the gems of 20th century writing. Nobody reads them anymore. It's hard to find
It's
them.
true. They're out of print. Okay.
I recently picked up a copy of Schnitzler's memoirs about his youth in Hungary before he became a famous writer. And it's very interesting.
I wish we had talked to her more about that. I think that would have been very interesting.
She didn't talk much about it.
She didn't talk
No.
much about
We
it.
tried a lot of times, and we finally got a lot. quite a
mentioned
bit out of it,
seeing
not a lot.
Bartok on the streetcar and sitting next to him once, and having grown up in the vicinity, the neighborhood that he had lived in.
But he was older than she
Interesting
was.
about
Older,
his
yeah.
sister,
Oh yeah.
Well,
20
she
years.
did.
How did you get to know her sister?
Well, we
know
finally
her
got it
sister?
out of it that she had sisters and where they were. We asked her about her family, how many sisters
When
and so
she
on.
had the stroke in Paris, her sister came from Rotterdam.
Yeah,
to
but we
stay
knew
with
about
her.
the sister before that.
That's
Well,
true, we
I
didn't.
knew George's mother and his brother and his
You-
sister.
Oh, you did. Well, I just
Yeah.
went and visited the house in Trenton. Well, one of the several houses.
Well, his sister and his brother should still be alive.
She had two.
George's
One
sister died.
She did?
Yes.
She was much younger.
Yes, she's dead. His brother is dead.
They were both much younger because there had been a lot of dead children and miscarriages between
Yes,
them.
that's right. Well, Henry,
So
of course, is
yeah,
from the war, but
so
then-
George was in his 30s, and his sister was about 18 or 17. Do you know? And all the children,
Christine.
yeah, and all the children in between had died.
Yes.
And then his brother was still younger. His brother was about 16 or 15.
And that was the one that was killed in the war. Henry.
He was killed in the war?
He was
George
shot.
never mentioned that.
He was shot down in 1941 over Finland.
George never mentioned that.
He didn't.
No.
Mention what?
His brother.
His brother Henry died in the war in 1941. He was shot at.
But-
There was his ship was torpedoed as well.
Yeah. But I remember one day when they were living in Barrow Street, and I was at the apartment, suddenly the three of them turned up. You know?
Go to visit the mother once or
Yeah, she visited the mother. They lived in New Jersey, or Trenton.
That's right. Yeah.
And,
And you say you went to Trenton.
no.
You
no.
never went to
Beshka
Trenton.
went to Trenton. She was here and she went to Trenton.
Oh, yeah.
That's right. So I know they were
That would
still
have been
living
in
in
the early
Trenton.
30s, I think. No.
No,
a little later.
much later.
Well,
Oh,
she
is
was
that?
still on much later, probably maybe.
Yeah, because I didn't come to New York till 1939.
39, so it was after that. They lived in Barrow Street in the early 30s, you said.
First they lived in Barrow Street for that spring. Then, I forget where, they lived on 55th Street.
That's right.
55th between Lexington and 3rd. And then they moved to Hollywood.
A memory for dates like a book, boy.
I remember the house.
Encyclopedia,
The
that's
house is
awesome.
gone.
Well, that's good. It really, because especially our time sometimes remember which years things happen. She get dates
Yeah,
confused.
she really did.
You know, she had the years off sometimes, 2 or 3 years off.
Well, sometimes I say, no, that couldn't have been 36. You know, I get that confused. But those are wild years. You know, the kids nowadays think that they've discovered life and living. Believe me, what went on in the 30s and the 40s. And when you read about the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s seem calm, you know. I was just reading Tynan's article on Louise Brooks. My God, that was a wild period, and a wild life, you know. And the same with Brecht and Weil. You know, Brecht arrived here. I was working on his production Mother, which he did with Hans Eisler. Some friends and I had started a theater called the Theater Union. I was kind of music director of it. And in an unhappy moment, we decided to do Mother by Brecht, based upon the Gorky novel. It destroyed our theater. Brecht came over. But he came over with his wife, mistress, and another girlfriend, a new girlfriend. And, you know, this entourage, he walked down looking like a priest with his head. His hair was cropped all over his head. It was about 1/4 of an inch. And he had, it looked like a cowl, you know, a monk's cape or something, and he'd march down with this somber mien, trying to frighten everybody, and being nasty as whenever he could. Well, I remember when...
Makes George sound like an angel, huh?
Oh, George was a charmer. Brecht was an evil man. Great poet, but an evil man. But I remember when Kurt Weill came to this country for the first time. I had met Kurt in Europe, and I went to see him. And he was living at the San Moritz, remember, on 6th Avenue and 59th Street. And I told him that Brecht was here, and Kurt turned absolutely ashen and said, "Don't tell him I'm in New York, don't tell him I'm in New York." You know, do anything to escape that monster.
Isn't that something?
Weill with Brecht, you know.
We just saw at the Ojai Festival the Hindemith's collaboration with Brecht called De Leerstück,
De
which is
Leerstück, yeah.
all sort of about Lindbergh. A crazy piece.
About what?
About Lindbergh.
Yeah, well, that's the same one that Weill did as Lindbergh Flug. They used the same librettos.
But in this story, the audience is asked whether or not to save the dying pilot who's now crashed on the mountainside, and they decide in the end to let him die because he hasn't done anything for mankind. I mean, that's pretty cold, isn't it?
No, well, his Lindbergh Flug is not like that. They're the pilot's a hero. But
Shall I show them the cover of your record?
Yeah.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
No, not in the color, but just the uncolored. It's a
The,
riot. It's a riot.
no, but Actually, Kurt was the genius in that combination. I mean, the Threepenny Opera and Mahagoni and the Seven Deadly Sins are the things that Brecht will be remembered for, and he'll be remembered for them because Kurt did such a fantastic job. It's sheer genius. Do you know the Seven Deadly Sins?
It's fantastic.
It's a fantastic piece. Constant Lambert calls it, along with Mio's Creation of the World, as one of the two seminal pieces of the 1920s, and it is. I mean, those two pieces were more important than people give them credit for being. And also Lambert's On the Rio Grande, which I think is a most underrated composition.
There's somebody, who was it, who was doing a book on Lambert? No, I'm thinking of somebody who's doing a book on Lord Berners.
Lord Berners, well, no, Lambert's a much better composer.
Lambert,
He didn't write enough. He died too young. But things like Summer's Last Will and Testament, and the Piano Concerto, and Pomona, and Rio Grande is really a really major compositions that have been forgotten.
Were you around when they recorded Lambert's work on MGM here in the 50s? Or that wasn't at your
But
institution?
I was here when they gave the first performance when Beecham did the Rio Grande, its first New York performance. And I remember how exciting that was, you know. And now I bought Andre Previn's record, and it's not a good performance. It's not clear, you know. And that's a work that should be done with crystal clarity. I don't think it's Andre's fault. I think it was the recording fault. I think they took a performance, you know, a recording of a performance. He didn't do it in a hall,
Yeah.
so it couldn't be cleared up. And that's the only performance you can get of Rio Grande, and that's unfortunate, because the work is a gem.
Hmm.